the room falls silent. All eyes turn toward you, waiting for your response to a challenging question or provocative statement. The natural impulse is to fill this vacuum with words, to demonstrate knowledge, assert position, or relieve the mounting tension. This impulse feels almost biological, as if silence itself were a threat to be neutralized through speech. But what if this impulse is precisely what surrenders your advantage? What if silence, properly deployed, is not weakness, but one of the most powerful tools at your disposal? Niccolò Machiavelli, the 16th century Florentine philosopher whose insights on power remain unmatched, understood that true strategic mastery often manifests not through what is said, but through what is deliberately left unsaid. The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, Machiavelli observed in The Prince, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. This recognition underpins perhaps his most subtle insight: that strategic silence can accomplish what even the most eloquent words cannot. This isn't about shyness or social anxiety. It's about the deliberate weaponization of absence, of information, of reaction, of presence itself. Throughout history, the most effective power players have recognized that controlling communication means controlling not just what is expressed, but what is withheld and when. From negotiation tables to boardrooms, from political arenas to personal relationships, the strategic deployment of silence creates advantages that verbose brilliance cannot match. Machiavelli himself embodied this principle. After falling from political grace, he retreated to his country estate where his apparent silence concealed the composition of works that would ultimately give him more lasting power than any political office. This pattern repeats across history. The most consequential figures often master the art of strategic withdrawal, calculated restraint, and silence that speaks more powerfully than words ever could. In a world that increasingly rewards constant expression and visibility, the Machiavellian insight about the power of strategic silence has become not less relevant, but more essential. Understanding when not to speak, when to create tension rather than relieve it, and how to leverage absence as presence may be the most overlooked aspect of strategic wisdom, and potentially your most powerful advantage in a world that can't stop talking. The psychological power of strategic silence. At the heart of Machiavelli's understanding of power dynamics was his recognition of fundamental psychological patterns that transcend time and culture. His observations about silence tap into several of these patterns that modern psychological research has confirmed and elaborated. First is what psychologists now call the self-disclosure bias, our tendency to reveal more than is strategically optimal. Humans experience psychological pressure to reciprocate disclosure, to demonstrate knowledge, and to relieve social tension through speech. This pressure creates a consistent bias toward saying too much rather than too little, particularly in high-pressure situations. Machiavelli recognized this tendency centuries before formal psychological research, observing that men are so simple of mind and so much dominated by their immediate needs that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived. This insight isn't about deception, but about the exploitability of predictable communication patterns. When others reliably say too much, strategic silence creates asymmetric advantage. Second is the ambiguity effect. How silence creates space that others feel compelled to fill with their own projections, assumptions, and often concessions. In the absence of clear information, people typically construct narratives based on their fears, desires, and biases. By controlling what remains unsaid, you indirectly influence these constructions in ways that often serve your objectives more effectively. than explicit statements. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are, Machiavelli wrote. This gap between appearance and reality creates the space where strategic silence operates most powerfully. By withholding certain expressions or reactions, you create a canvas onto which others project meanings that often attribute more calculation, knowledge, or power than might be conveyed through explicit communication. Third is what modern game theorists call information asymmetry advantage, the strategic edge gained by knowing more than you reveal. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, Machiavelli observed. This insight recognizes that power often depends less on what you know than on the gap between what you know and what others perceive you know. Strategic silence maintains and expands this gap. This principle operates across contexts. In negotiations, the party that reveals less about their position, alternatives, and constraints typically secures better terms. In leadership, the judicious withholding of complete information creates space for initiative while maintaining directional control. In relationships, selective disclosure often creates more compelling engagement than complete transparency. In each case, power flows not from complete concealment, but from strategic control over the information differential. The tension of unrelieved pressure. Beyond information control, Machiavelli understood the power of unresolved tension. Men shrink less from offending one who inspires love than one who inspires fear, he noted in The Prince. This observation reveals how calculated discomfort can be more effective than reassurance in certain contexts. Strategic silence creates psychological pressure that most people find difficult to tolerate. When a question hangs unanswered, when a challenge receives no immediate response, when information remains conspicuously withheld, a form of tension develops. Most people instinctively seek to relieve this tension through speech, offers, or concessions. The strategist who can tolerate this discomfort longer than others gains significant advantage. This dynamic appears consistently in negotiation contexts. The party that can comfortably maintain silence after making an offer or receiving a proposal typically secures better terms. This isn't manipulation, but recognition of how psychological pressure influences decision-making. By resisting the impulse to fill silence with concessions or clarifications, you create space for the other party to move toward your position, rather than requiring you to move toward theirs. The same principle operates in interrogation and information-gathering contexts. If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared, Machiavelli wrote. While this specific advice is ethically problematic, the underlying psychological insight is sound. Incomplete pressure often generates more response than complete force. The strategic questioner who asks and then falls silent often elicits more information than one who continues speaking. Leadership contexts demonstrate this principle as well. When a leader poses a challenge or question to a team and then maintains silence rather than immediately offering direction, they create space for others to develop solutions rather than merely implement instructions. This calculated tension develops capability rather than dependency, creating stronger organizational outcomes than constant guidance. Machiavelli recognized that the capacity to maintain tension without premature resolution often distinguishes effective from ineffective strategy. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present, he observed. This isn't advocacy for dishonesty, but recognition that maintaining strategic flexibility sometimes requires calculated ambiguity rather than premature commitment. The calculated absence as presence. Perhaps the most subtle aspect of Machiavellian silence is what might be called weaponized absence, the strategic withdrawal of presence itself to create specific effects. This approach operates not just through what remains unsaid, but through the complete removal of expected participation or engagement. Hence, it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong, and to make use of it or not according to necessity, Machiavelli wrote. This principle applies to presence itself. Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't perfect engagement, but calculated withdrawal. Not to disengage entirely, but to create specific effects through the conspicuous absence of expected participation. This approach appears in multiple contexts. In negotiations, the strategic withdrawal, whether from specific topics or entire sessions, often creates more leverage than continued engagement. In relationships, the calculated absence often generates more engagement than constant presence. In organizational contexts, selective non-participation in certain decisions or discussions can highlight their importance more effectively than active opposition. The power of this approach stems from what behavioral economists call loss aversion, the human tendency to feel losses more acutely than equivalent gains. When your presence or participation is expected and then withdrawn, others typically experience this as a form of loss that motivates stronger response than the mere absence of gain. By controlling this pattern, you influence behavior more effectively than through direct instruction or persuasion. Machiavelli himself demonstrated this principle in his career. After his fall from political power, his apparent withdrawal from public life created space for the composition of works that would ultimately give him more lasting influence than any political position could have provided. His physical absence from centers of power paradoxically increased his intellectual presence in them. This pattern appears consistently among effective strategists. The calculated step back often creates more impact than continued forward pressure. The conspicuous non-response frequently generates more attention than any direct reply. The selective withdrawal from expected participation often motivates more accommodation than continued engagement. In each case, absence functions not as surrender, but as strategic leverage. The information vacuum and power. Beyond psychological pressure, strategic silence creates what might be called an information vacuum that shapes others' decision-making in predictable ways. Machiavelli understood that human reasoning operates differently under conditions of incomplete information than complete information, creating opportunities for strategic advantage. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see, to few to feel, Machiavelli observed. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. This insight reveals why controlled information flows create such significant advantages. When others must act based on incomplete information, they typically rely on heuristics and assumptions that can be anticipated and leveraged. This dynamic appears consistently in competitive contexts. In military strategy, selective information denial forces opponents to prepare for multiple contingencies, dividing their resources where yours remain concentrated. In business competition, strategic ambiguity about intentions or capabilities often leads competitors to either overcommit resources defensively or miss opportunities through excessive caution. In political contests, calculated silence on certain positions often creates space for broader coalition building than explicit stances would permit. The principle extends to personal and professional advancement as well. By strategically withholding certain information about capabilities or intentions, you often create more advantageous positioning than through complete transparency. not through deception, but through controlled disclosure that allows others to form assessments aligned with your objectives rather than limiting them. Machiavelli recognized that power often depends less on what is known than on who controls what is known when. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, he wrote. This observation applies equally to information flows. The strategic mind doesn't seek to know everything, but to control critical information differentials at key decision points. This approach operates not through manipulation, but through recognition of how information environments shape decision-making. By controlling not just what you say, but what you conspicuously don't say, you influence the decision environment more effectively than through direct persuasion alone. The calculated response timing. Beyond content control, Machiavelli understood the strategic importance of timing in communication. The wise man does at once what the fool does finally, he observed. This principle applies particularly to response timing, knowing not just what to say or withhold, but precisely when to break silence for maximum effect. Strategic timing operates through several mechanisms. First is what negotiation theorists call deadline power, the advantage gained by the party less constrained by time pressure. By controlling your response timing independently of others' expectations, you create asymmetric pressure that typically results in more favorable terms or concessions. This dynamic appears consistently in negotiation contexts. The party that responds immediately to proposals typically secures worse terms than one who introduces calculated delays. This isn't about arbitrary waiting, but about creating space for the other party's commitment to strengthen before revealing your position. The strategic pause often achieves what immediate clever responses cannot. The principle extends to conflict management as well. If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared, Machiavelli famously wrote. While the specific advice is morally problematic, the underlying insight about timing is sound. Responses delivered at unexpected moments, either much sooner or much later than anticipated, typically create more impact than those delivered when expected. Leadership contexts demonstrate this principle clearly. The leader who responds immediately to every issue typically diminishes both their perceived authority and actual effectiveness. Conversely, the leader who introduces calculated delays before certain responses often enhances both perception and impact. This isn't about procrastination, but about controlling engagement timing for strategic purposes. Machiavelli recognized that timing control often distinguishes effective from ineffective strategy. By breaking silence at precisely calculated moments, rather than in response to others' timing expectations, you maintain initiative even when not currently speaking. This control creates advantages across scenarios from negotiation to conflict, from leadership to relationship management. The selective expertise display. Perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of Machiavellian silence is what might be called selective expertise display, the strategic choice to withhold knowledge or capability demonstrations in certain contexts while revealing them in others. This approach operates not through ignorance, but through calculated control over what expertise becomes visible when. Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, Machiavelli observed, because it belongs to everybody to see, to few to feel. This insight reveals why controlled expertise display creates such significant advantages. When expertise becomes visible only at strategically optimal moments, its impact typically exceeds what continuous demonstration would achieve. This dynamic appears consistently in professional contexts. The colleague who speaks rarely but with precision when they do typically commands more attention and influence than one who demonstrates knowledge constantly. The professional who reveals specialized expertise selectively often advances more rapidly than one who displays it indiscriminately. The leader who reveals insight at decisive moments rather than continuously typically generates more impact with less resistance. The principle extends to negotiation and conflict contexts as well. By selectively withholding certain knowledge or capabilities until strategically optimal moments, you often create more advantageous positioning than through complete transparency. The negotiator who reveals certain expertise only after the other party has committed to a position. The competitor who demonstrates capabilities only after opponents have committed resources based on incomplete assessment. The strategist who reveals understanding only after others have exposed their thinking. Machiavelli himself embodied this principle. His writings reveal deep historical knowledge and political insight. Yet during his political career, this expertise was deployed selectively rather than displayed continuously. This controlled revelation created more impact than constant demonstration would have achieved, contributing to his effectiveness in roles of significant influence, despite lacking formal authority. This approach operates not through deception about capability, but through strategic control over its demonstration. By revealing expertise selectively rather than continuously, you create asymmetric advantage through both the perception gap your silence creates and the timing impact of revelation at moments of maximum leverage. The ethical dimensions and limitations. Any discussion of Machiavellian strategy inevitably raises ethical questions, particularly when that strategy involves calculated silence that might be interpreted as deception or manipulation. These concerns deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal. Machiavelli himself is often mischaracterized as advocating pure amorality in pursuit of advantage. A closer reading reveals a more nuanced position focused on effectiveness within the constraints of actual human behavior rather than idealized standards. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good, he observed. This isn't endorsement of evil, but recognition of practical constraints. Strategic silence occupies ethically complex territory. When it involves actual deception, misleading statements, or manipulation toward harmful ends, it clearly crosses ethical boundaries. When it involves mere control over disclosure timing, information asymmetry management, or pressure tolerance, ethical evaluation becomes more contextual. The key ethical distinction often lies in intention and impact rather than specific tactics. Strategic silence intended to prevent premature judgment, maintain legitimate negotiating position, or create space for others' development differs fundamentally from silence designed to enable exploitation, avoid accountability, or inflict unnecessary harm. The same approach that builds organizational capability in one context might enable manipulation in another. Machiavelli recognized these distinctions, noting that in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, where there is no court of appeal, one judges by the result. This consequentialist perspective suggests evaluating strategic silence not by abstract standards, but by its actual effects on those involved. Silence that ultimately enables better outcomes for all parties differs ethically from silence that benefits one at others' expense. The limitations of strategic silence appear in several contexts. In collaborative environments requiring mutual trust, excessive information control often undermines the foundation necessary for effective cooperation. In leadership roles with accountability responsibilities, strategic silence can conflict with transparency obligations. In personal relationships, calculated absence or response timing may damage connection, when used manipulatively rather than developmentally. Machiavelli understood these limitations, distinguishing between strategies appropriate for different contexts and objectives. A prince cannot observe all those things for which men are considered good, he wrote, recognizing that different roles carry different ethical constraints. This nuanced view suggests not universal application of strategic silence, but contextual deployment based on role responsibilities and legitimate objectives. The integrated strategic approach. Strategic silence ultimately functions not in isolation, but as part of an integrated approach to effective action. Machiavelli recognized that power emerges not from single tactics, but from comprehensive strategic understanding deployed contextually. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, Machiavelli observed. This insight applies equally to strategic communication. The effective strategist recognizes that silence gains meaning from what surrounds it, from what has been said previously, from what others are saying currently, from what remains to be said subsequently. This contextual deployment creates impact far beyond what isolated silence could achieve. This integration appears in how effective operators combine strategic silence with calculated disclosure. They withhold certain information while strategically revealing other elements that shape interpretation of what remains unsaid. They maintain silence in some contexts, while speaking definitively in others, to create contextual contrast. They withdraw presence selectively rather than universally, to maximize the impact of both engagement and absence. The mastery extends to different silence types deployed for specific effects. Information silence withholds certain knowledge to maintain advantage. Reactive silence controls emotional and intellectual responses to create space for others' commitment. Presence silence manages engagement timing and intensity to maximize impact when participation does occur. Each serves distinct strategic functions within an integrated approach. Machiavelli understood that strategic effectiveness requires this integration, not rigid application of techniques, but fluid deployment based on specific context and objectives. A prudent man must always follow in the path trodden by great men and imitate those who have been most excellent, he wrote, but immediately qualified that imitation must adapt to current circumstances rather than slavishly following past patterns. This integrated approach recognizes strategic silence not as manipulation, but as realistic engagement with actual human behavior patterns. Used ethically toward legitimate objectives, it creates not exploitation, but effectiveness. The capacity to achieve worthwhile ends through minimal means by working with human psychology rather than against it or in ignorance of it. Machiavelli's enduring influence stems precisely from this integrated perspective. He remains studied not because he advocated amoral power pursuit, but because he recognized how actual human behavior operates and how this understanding enables more effective action. Strategic silence represents perhaps his most subtle insight, that power often flows not from what is expressed, but from what is deliberately left unexpressed. The modern strategist leverages this insight not through sinister manipulation, but through thoughtful information management that recognizes both the psychological reality of human interaction and the ethical complexity of strategic action. This balanced approach creates not just tactical advantage, but strategic wisdom, the capacity to achieve meaningful objectives through sophisticated understanding rather than brute force or naive transparency. But there's a dimension to strategic silence that even Machiavelli only partially articulated, a level where the absence of words reveals not just tactical advantage, but fundamental truth about human communication itself.